Okay, I think I'm gonna get this webinar, get going here. Masi sotene sila deneze nake ko suje. Good day, everybody. Nice to see everybody virtually. My name is Deneze Nake Ko. I'm Denisu Tlene in Decho Dene from Denin Day. And as Dene people up here, we really like the letter D. So I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be the moderator / facilitator for this webinar, Gonèk'e, on our land. So thank you all for attending this webinar on UNDRIp and Modern Treaties. We have a stellar panel, lots of knowledge that they'll be sharing and presenting with us during this webinar. Got Matthew Mahaffey, who will present on treaty financing in UNDRIp. Also, Jennifer Duncan will provide an overview of her experiences on the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples and Treaty Negotiation. Also with us, we have John B. Zoe, who will present on how UNDRIp can be a tool to build on Indigenous strengths. And Hayden King will speak on the importance of a monitoring mechanism for UNDRIp. For those that are wondering, I'm in the Hoti Tsita offices, 10th floor in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, or sometimes in our language known as Sambake Denin Day. And I just wanted to extend a warm welcome to everybody out there. To get going, up here, we have certain protocol in how we conduct ourselves. And one of the ways we conduct ourselves in our protocol is through spiritual connections to make sure that all our connections are strong and maintained. And we're going to go to John B. Zoe for a little opening. He's going to share a spiritual connection with us. So we can go to John B. now.
Good morning. It's a good forum to be in this morning, talking about everything that we've always known and trying to get to the forefront in a system that hasn't been too friendly for since colonization. But at the same time, in this strengthening exercise that we're going through in our own areas, that worldwide there has been some work going on by many people, and it's taken years, and we're starting to see a product. It's that product that's been on stage for a number of years, but coming to that forefront, I think it takes a lot of time. Not on our side, but mostly on the decision makers Canada-wide. And it's getting closer if it's not already here. Now it's how do we use it, and how do we kind of familiarize ourselves with it. And I think this is a forum for that, is to ensure that we have something that we have in common, and how we can expand on it using our different methods that we have developed across the country. And with that, it's also a time for Thanksgiving, to say masi, especially for the creator for allowing it to happen. And so we have some new things that we can work with. So I'll be doing the Lord's Prayer in Clinchon, and so I'll do that now. Good time, when the Kulai, Niz Lega, it's a din day, Ninkai Wu, Nehonawun day, Yakin is equal, Ike, Dineke, Chinese, Wunide. What are Zentantes and these Zinkigo and Indi? Dagu gets on a whole day, who's a Ike who gets on a get Nele. What cleans any wounds are going AD, what can go on a one. Digo sewing down will lesson. Needs a kind of war, news in on it, so needs a new cigars in the on there. Amen. Masicho.
Masi John B. Zoe. I appreciate that, starting us off in the protocol with their spiritual connections. Today's webinar is the first of a series titled Gonèk'e, On Our Land, with a focus on highlighting the recent progress, innovations, and current challenges, and modern treaty implementation as a basis for policy learning and best practices, but also a little bit of nation building, hopefully. Inform um, I'd like to inform the attendees to look out for later webinars in a series in September, October, November, and December. And hopefully at one of those, maybe if we're all vaccinated, we could actually get together in real life. The webinar series has been organized by the Modern Treaties Implementation Research Project, a research project that works to produce diverse and nuanced understandings of modern treaties for policy learning and best practices. The Modern Treaties Implementation Research Project is a partnership between the Land Claims Agreements Coalition and Carleton University, with a national office hosted by the Qingzhou government. It is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. So just shout out to them. And I'd like to encourage those attending the webinar to post questions and discussion points in the chat throughout the webinar. So all questions will be answered after the panel discussion. We'll try to get to a lot of the comments and discussion points that people leave in the chat. Also, just another housekeeping, just make sure that you are on mute, just to be courteous to the webinar and to the presenters of the panel as well too. Excuse me. The discussion today comes at a critical time, just as a few days ago, the Senate passed Bill C-15, which seeks to align Canadian law with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. UNDRIp was overwhelmingly adopted by the UN General Assembly back in 2007. 144 countries voted in favor, 11 abstained, and 4 voted against. Canada is one of the 4 countries that opposed it, but it has formally reversed its decision in 2010. UNDRIP consists of 46 articles that were a product of more than 20 years of deliberation between UN member states and Indigenous peoples. UNDRIP does not create new rights, but reaffirms pre-existing rights, which have often been undermined. Indigenous people make up 5% of the global population, but account for 15% of the population in extreme poverty. These extreme trends extend into Canada. The purpose of UNDRIP is therefore to set minimum standards for the individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples. Central to the Indigenous rights is the right to self-determination, to freely pursue their political, socioeconomic, and cultural development. Today's talk brings together an excellent and diverse panel of researchers and practitioners who specialize in modern treaties in the North and across Canada. We have a practitioner experience in the area of land claims and self-government negotiation and implementation, a researcher in Indigenous nationhood and colonialism, and 2 legal experts. The speakers will give their perspectives on UNDRIP and its implications for modern treaties. So to get right into it, we're going to be going to Hayden King, Anishinaabe. This is the importance of a monitoring mechanism for UNDRIP in relation to modern treaties. Hayden King is the executive director to the Yellowhead Institute. Hayden King has taught Indigenous politics and policy since 2007 and has conducted research and made publications on Indigenous policy as well as land and research management. So for our first panelist today, we'll head over to Hayden King. Hayden, the floor is virtually all yours.
Thank you. You have the power to mute and unmute, Denise. Thank you for the introduction. And yeah, I'm happy to be here and have this conversation with everybody. In my bio, you mentioned that I started teaching and writing and researching in 2007. It feels like a really long time ago, but that was also the year that the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples became a declaration at the United Nations. And so I effectively began my teaching career teaching about the Declaration. And in that very long span of time from then until now, I think it was mostly characterized by a lot of frustration, at least among me and my peers, that there was so little action. And I know there was frustration among the people that actually drafted the Declaration and negotiated with states over those 20 years to have it come to life. It isn't the Declaration that, you know, those original drafters, including people that belong to Modern Treaties, wanted, but it's what we got, and now we've got to figure out how to work with it, and we've got to figure out how to work with it in a Canadian context. You know, it is a bit bizarre. Bizarre might not be the right word. It's strange to come full circle from continually putting pressure on the federal government to be accountable and to provide implementation legislation for this declaration for years and years, and now finally to be here and to be looking at this legislation and figuring out, okay, does it do what we need it to do? Are there limitations? What will the challenges be? And so there isn't really anywhere else to look for guidance, because Canada is actually the first jurisdiction to have both provincial and federal pieces of legislation, or very soon to be federal legislation on UNDRIP implementation. So this is actually the first real attempt to do it. And so now it falls upon us to figure out how we actually implement this declaration and implement it across the diverse jurisdictions in this country now called Canada. And so for me, I guess I've been thinking a little bit about the implementation side of things and the challenges that I see in implementation. A lack of a monitoring body is just one of those challenges among many others. And I look to the work of Dr. Cheryl Lightfoot, who has spent a career on the Declaration and various other international human rights instruments, lobbying on behalf of Indigenous communities and people. And Dr. Lightfoot talked about 4 effective measures towards implementation. And those 4 measures were federal enabling legislation, national action plans on the progress in collaboration with Indigenous people, and an independent monitoring body to assess whether or not there's been progress on any implementation. So we got part of the way there with the federal legislation. The government didn't subscribe to all 4 of those points, but we got the federal implementation legislation. We got the action plan. So the federal government recognizes that we can't make any progress on implementing the Declaration without collaborating with Indigenous people and developing these so-called action plans to determine how we're going to actually implement it. Independent monitoring bodies. We didn't get that. Instead, what we got were a report to Parliament on the progress of implementing UNDRIP in Canada. So in that sense, the federal legislation has at least one glaring gap, but I think that there are other gaps that are worth mentioning as well. So of course, without an independent monitoring body, we can expect to see interpretation gaps on implementation. And what I mean by that is this government in particular, and the previous Liberal government, interpret progress in very specific, discrete ways that Indigenous peoples may not interpret that same progress. And so while there has to be collaboration on the action plans and there has to be collaboration on reporting on the progress, there doesn't necessarily have to be on consensus. There doesn't necessarily have to be consensus around what represents progress. And so it's very likely that we'll have a federal government suggesting that we've made progress, and in other cases, some Indigenous representatives saying, you know, no, we haven't. And that leads me to think about in 3 or 4 years, when reporting on UNDRIP legislation takes place, whether or not there will be potentially protests by the national Indigenous organizations or Indigenous communities on this disagreement around what constitutes progress. And again, if we had an independent monitoring body, that might have limited any interpretation gaps on implementation. But there are other challenges. There is no clear process at the moment for aligning new or old federal laws with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I mean, the whole point of the legislation is to bring into alignment federal laws with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. But as of, well, right now, there is no actual process. British Columbia has proposed a sort of quasi-secretariat to bring Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, or sorry, government officials together to figure out how to do this. But there are lingering questions. Can the federal government pass new laws if a process hasn't been in place? Or can the federal government pass a new law if it doesn't align with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People? It's not actually clear. And I'm sure one of our legal scholars or legal experts on the panel will hopefully help clarify that. But then the process for aligning old laws, how will we do that? How will we take these pieces of legislation that have been passed last year, last decade, last century, and bring them into alignment with the Declaration? It's not yet clear. So that'll be a challenge. I think a third challenge is going to be around the pace of implementation. I think in British Columbia, we've seen very little progress, especially against the backdrop of, let's just use as an example, the Wet'suwet'en versus Coastal GasLink pipeline, which many people expected the provincial declaration law to mitigate that conflict. It did not. It dragged on right actually into the pandemic. And so with a 3-year window before the federal government needs to introduce its first action plan, we can expect the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples implementation progress to be very slow. Hopefully not too slow that people sort of fill that time with apathy and neglect of the process and the legislation, but that's a very real possibility. A fourth challenge, to date, there's been a lack of community voices in the drafting of the legislation. People like me were able to speak to staff from the Attorney General's office, but there is a growing movement among community members on the ground that are saying, this is actually not, we don't want this legislation. No one talked to us. We're afraid that this is going to compromise Section 35. And those voices are there. I'm not sure if they're getting louder or not, but there's a lot of skepticism at the community level because they haven't been a part of this process. So that's yet another challenge. One that I imagine that we'll talk a little bit about today is around jurisdictional confusion. It's not clear how the federal legislation will impact Northwest Territories, Yukon, or Nunavut, where there's this mix of federal and territorial and First Nation, Inuit, Métis levels of authority. And it is unclear how the declaration will impact the regulatory regime in particular. And so that's an outstanding question. It's not necessarily a challenge if everybody can come together and understand how the declaration is going to affect all the parties in a modern treaty context, but that will be an additional one. And then finally, I think one that has been the most difficult for Canada to embrace to date is the conversation around free, prior, and informed consent. Free, prior, and informed consent appears in most forcefully in Article 32 of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, but actually in a few other areas of the Declaration. It encourages state governments to earn the consent of Indigenous peoples before any major decisions that affect them take place. Could be a piece of legislation, could be again a pipeline. Canada has steadfastly suggested that the duty to consult can effectively be a stand-in for free, prior, and informed consent. I do not believe that's the position of most Indigenous people in Canada. And so this is going to be yet another challenge, the overcoming, I guess, yet another interpretation challenge around what consent is and whether consent is consultation. And of course, the layers of consent from reserve settings to title lands to modern treaty contexts to crown lands. How does consent operate in each of these jurisdictions, or rather each of these land tenure systems? For me, I think that this is the most important challenge to overcome. Of course, they're all important to overcome, but consent for me really unlocks a lot of questions around self-determination and land rights, ones that Canada has been grappling with for, well, 151, 152 years. Beyond that, and so if consent can be operationalized through this declaration or through the declaration in tandem with perhaps modern treaties or perhaps First Nations with title claims, that could be a powerful force that could in some ways transform the collective relationship. And so while we have this piece of legislation that is in many ways sort of benign, it's light, it doesn't have too many legal obligations and requirements of the federal government, it could potentially have significant impact on the collective relationship if we figure out how to do that in a good way. So I think that's all I'll say in my 5 or 10 minutes that I have to begin this conversation, and I'll hand things back to you, Gonèk'e, and look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Hey, Masi, thank you very much there, Hayden King, for a lot of those points about the interpretation gaps and progress, not a real clear process and how to align this with new and old laws. I guess the pace of this, the top-down approach when it comes to UNDRIP, and I guess the local voices trying to be heard amongst all these things. Man, thanks for all those points there, Hayden. Up next, we're going to hear a presentation on UNDRIP as a tool to build on Indigenous strengths in treaty implementation. For that, we're going to go to John B. Zoe from the Clicho. John B. Zoe was the chief land claims negotiator for the former Treaty 11 Council of the NWT from 1994 until its conclusion with the establishment of the Clicho government in 2005. John B. Zoe is a senior advisor to the Clicho government and also chair of the Hotitsira Governing Council. Before we go to John, I just wanted to welcome all the participants that are joining us. This is Gonèk'e, Our Land, a webinar series. My name is Gonèk'e. I would just encourage participants and attendees, if you have discussion points or questions, to put them into the chat as we go through. Then after the panel discussion, hopefully we'll have enough time to address some of those discussion points. Also, I just wanted to mention that today's June 28th. Yesterday, June 27th, was actually 100 years of Treaty 11 up here in the NWT. Treaty 11 was made. The first stop was Fort Providence on June 27th in 1921. And I just came back from Fort Providence on a commemoration ceremonies of 100 years of Treaty 11. So lots of different connections here, and all this stuff is on the minds of many people. With that, though, we'll go to John B. Zoe for his presentation on UNDRIP as a tool to build on Indigenous strengths in treaty implementation. John?
Well, thank you very much. I just want to say that there's a lot of tools and developing tools, but one of the things about UNDRIP is that it's fairly new with no real strings attached, and what do we do with it? And the point is that, before colonization, we had everything that we needed. And after colonization, especially in the last 150 years, a lot of the stripping down has led us to where we are today in the Indian Act box. And now that we're kind of out of it, how do we strengthen ourselves, and how do we use the tools that are available to us? So I think I have a PowerPoint presentation that's supposed to go up here at this point. And so one of the things is that what do we do with the latest tool, and how do we have a discussion around it to try to make use of it? So the okay, there she is. And I'm not sure where we are.
There we go.
Okay, there it is. There it is. Okay, well, the first first PowerPoint is, yes, that's the one, is that UNDRIp and Modern Treaty Implementation, fixing the holes in the net, which is, originally in the old days, it's all about resources. And one of the resources that we relied on were the early fish nets. And if they're broken, we fix it. And that's how life goes. But, the big net across Canada has been broken many, many times. And there's no real tools to fix it with, because there's a lot of restrictions and a lot of challenges from where we are today. So the one of the things is that this slide acknowledges that this webinar is part of a larger project, and the Modern Treaty Implementation Research Project is a partnership between the Land Claim Coalition and Carleton University. The Provincial government hosts a national project office in Yellowknife, and so that's the second slide, the second slide here. And so we'll move on to the people one. Go back to the people, number 3, yeah. And so this slide gives an overview of who is involved in the Modern Treaties research project. Myself, I'm an advisor to the provincial government, and my role is on this is working with Hayden King on the lands theme. Our work focuses on modern treaties with respect to lands. And right now, the provincial government are working on some place names research in the region with Sadiklos Scott, a provincial researcher based in Yellowknife. And so this is a listing of the people that are involved, and the 5 themes under the thing. And so this is where we are now. So we'll go to the next slide. And the next slide would be number 4. I think we went a little bit too far. And so we'll go back to the slide before this. Yeah. And this is, these are some of the projects that the, Modern Treaty Implementation Research Project has produced to date, and some of them has to do with publications, and some of the things that are being done by different partners to the project. And so we'll go to the next slide. And this one here is understanding UNDRIp. The Galaga is a tool that is used to repair fish nets. And we believe that our big fish nets have been torn to many, many pieces. And how do we put it together? Well, we use a lot of tools in Canada. We use a lot of tools that we come up with ourselves in partnership with governments and agencies, and including ourselves. But with the UNDRIp, it's worldwide. It reaches many countries, so it's a tool that we've never had, like I say, up front, that we need to develop it to do what we can out of it. So all the, all peoples use fishnets. All people use fishnets, and fish is important, especially in the summer and all year. They can be made out of, in the old days before contact, they were made out of strip willows. And more recently, after the trade, then we turned to twine. So if the nets were damaged or torn, the kalaga is a tool used to fix them. And these are kind of photos of the Gwich'in and Clinchon nets that were made out of willow bark. And of the willows that the nets were made from among the Clinchon and the Gwich'in. So these are kind of like pictures of those early nets that were captured by museums and where they are held today. Masi, we'll go to the next one. And understanding UNDRIp, Kalaga, is this is a photo of people going on the ice to set nets. And the one on the right is Kalaga. It's a tool that's very common across the world. And it's used to fix the twine if the net is broken. By introducing new strands of twine to the net and holding it in place while knots are made to tie the different strands together. And so that's the metaphor of that tool. So we'll go on to the next one. And so applying the metaphor of the Kalaga to understand UNDRIp, that we can think of the net as all the laws, policies, our own knowledge about the land, our own laws and ways of doing things, our own governments, the way we work together in community to help one another. So there are a lot of different strands as it is. We are responsible for some to keep the strands strong. The government is responsible for other strands. Some government strands are imposed like the Indian Act. Other strands like modern treaties, we weave those in together. All of those things together creates a net that holds up our rights. So if the laws and policies are weak, if land claim agreements are not implemented or breached, these are holes in the net. And UNDRIp is a series of articles that describe our rights. So UNDRIp is like a kalaga. It can help us to fix the holes in the net. We take the UNDRIp and say, to make an agreement or implement the land claim agreement, the way we do that needs to be in a way that incorporates the relevant articles of the UNDRIp. The UNDRIp is like a kalaga, which makes sure we have a clear understanding and a framework on how the modern treaties should be implemented or how the modern treaties should be improved so that they come up to the standards described in the UNDRIp. And so we'll move on to the next slide. So why do we need a kalaga? Because the modern treaties are intended to recognize and implement Indigenous peoples' rights, but the ways that they are implemented do not always meet the standards we see in the articles of UNDRIp. As government policies and laws change, we have to continually talk to governments about where we can improve the treaties or settle disputes over areas where there are differences in understanding what the modern treaty means. So now that we know that Canada has now passed a law in the Senate on UNDRIP. It says we now have a law that will guide Canada in meeting the human rights standards in UNDRIP in what they do. So we know that now they now have the UNDRIP as their Galaga. It will probably take them a while to learn how to use it. We will have to work together to make sure it is that it is used properly, and that will take many different forms. It will take time to understand what it means for negotiating and implementing modern treaties and working with us to strengthen what we already have. So it's really up to us to work with them to understand where the holes are in the net and how to use the UNDRIP to make sure that the net is strong as possible now and for our future generations. So we'll go to the next slide. And so that's it. That's Masi, thank you very much on the presentation for the a short understanding of what the UNDRIP articles would mean to us in the implementation of what we're trying to do with the Modern Treaty Implementation Research Project. Masi Cho.
Hey, Masi John Bizo. Thank you for that presentation. I know I appreciate it. Sometimes you need some interpretation from all this legislation and all this other things. So it's really nice that you're able to lay it out in that way with Galaga and to be used as a tool to fix up a lot of the holes in the net that we're trying to make use of here in this country. So much appreciation for that there, John Bizo.
Thank you.
All right. The next presentation we're going to get to is negotiating modern treaties. In this presentation, the presenter will also give an overview of her experiences at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples and Treaty Negotiations. We have Jennifer Duncan with us, de la Gonèk'e, originally from the SA2. It's really nice to be able to connect with Jennifer in this way and have this opportunity for all of us to share our expertise and our knowledge, especially when it comes to UNDRIP. Jennifer Duncan is First Nation. She's a lawyer who specializes in the negotiation of agreements for First Nations with industry and government. Just get to her. All right, Jennifer, welcome. And the floor is virtually all yours.
Merci, Denise. Good afternoon and welcome to all the online participants, especially to the elders, including my mother, Dora Duncan, who was one of the interpreters and translators for the self-government negotiations I am involved in. And she's my #1 supporter and teacher. Welcome. To all the organizers of the event, especially Dr. Stephanie Erlbacher-Fox, Masi for the invitation to participate in this important webinar. Dora Duncan, Baytway, George Stewart Duncan, Baytway, Margaret Coetzee Besha, Philip Coetzee Sr. is my essay. I said in Gonèk'e that my mother is Dora Duncan and my father is George Stewart Duncan. Margaret Coetzee is my grandmother and Philip Coetzee Sr. is my grandfather. I am a member of the Betsiadaw First Nation and the Gonèk'e Land Corporation. I am from the T'oga-Gotenay. T'oga-Gotenay is one of the 4 Gotenays that make up the de la Gotine. T'oga means white lichen people. White lichen is a food that caribou love to eat, and we are blessed with many caribou on our land. De la Gotine means end of the earth people. I'm speaking to you all today from my traditional territory in the Arctic Northwest Territories, Canada. And it is my pleasure to be here and to share my experience as part of the negotiation team for my nation as we are negotiating with the Government of Canada and the Government of the Northwest Territories for a self-government agreement, which is also known as a modern treaty. I participate in the negotiations for all the chapters of the self-government agreement, and I am especially involved in negotiations for the Justice chapter. As Denise mentioned, I am a lawyer, and so the Justice Chapter is especially relevant to me. And I have been advocating in the field of Indigenous rights for the last 16 years. A bit about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and then I'll talk a bit about my involvement in United Nations related activities. First, as we heard from the previous speakers, UNDRIp was adopted in 2007 by the General Assembly of the United Nations. And on June 21st, 2021, Indigenous Day here in Canada and the summer solstice, Canadian legislation to advance the implementation of UNDRIp came into force and effect. It's taken 14 years since UNDRIp was adopted by the General Assembly for the Canadian state to bring into force legislation to implement UNDRIp. And during that time, Indigenous people in Canada have been working very hard to get UNDRIp to be respected by the Canadian government, and we still have a long way to go, again, as you heard from the previous speakers. My involvement in UN-related activities began a number of years ago as I recognized the importance of international law tools to make a difference domestically. One of my experiences includes participation in the 2015 Paris Agreement negotiations for the Framework Convention on Climate Change, when I joined the International Indigenous Peoples Caucus on Climate Change and advocated for the inclusion of Indigenous peoples' rights into the Paris Agreement. It was an exciting event, and everyone who participated in the negotiations worked very hard. I am especially grateful to retired Dene Chief, National Chief Bill Erasmus, who stayed an extra few days at the Paris Agreement negotiations to teach me the inner workings of the United Nations, introduce me to a wide array of Indigenous advocates from across the world, and to advocate at my side. The inclusion of Indigenous peoples' language in the Paris Agreement is of special interest to me, as my Indigenous government, which represents Indigenous peoples in the Arctic, is addressing significant issues regarding traditional knowledge, the knowledge of Indigenous peoples and local knowledge systems, as well as technologies, practices, and efforts of local communities and Indigenous peoples related to addressing and responding to climate change, specifically in the context of caribou here in the Arctic in my traditional territory. Most recently, I participated as part of the Canada delegation to the 19th session of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. The Permanent Forum is a high-level advisory body to the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. It is mandated to deal with Indigenous issues related to economic and social development, culture, the environment, education, health, and human rights. The theme of this year's Permanent Forum was Peace, Justice, and Strong Institutions, the role of Indigenous peoples in implementing Sustainable Development Goal 16. Sustainable Development Goal 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions is aimed at promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Today, as I recall all the years of treaty negotiation and experience with UNDRIp, the message I would like to pass along is that the ability to rely on the declaration in our negotiations has been tremendously empowering. Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination is firmly entrenched throughout UNDRIp, and especially in Articles 3 and 4. And I'm going to read those articles out because it's really important. I know we're all very busy and a lot of us don't have time to read the articles, so I'm just going to read it out here. Article 3 states, Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Article 4 states, Indigenous peoples, in exercising their right to self-determination, have the right to autonomy or self-government and matters relating to their internal and local affairs, as well as ways and means for financing their autonomous functions. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is significant in the negotiation of a self-government agreement. As often in my experience, in the negotiations, when we are explaining the rationale to the state parties, namely the Government of Canada and the Government of Northwest Territories, when we're explaining why we need a specific clause in our agreement, we are often able to rely on the principles and articles of the UN Declaration to help us articulate our reasons as to why it is important to us to include a specific clause, or why certain words in a specific clause are important. The Declaration has often given me strength and clarity to know that the words that we are negotiating hard for to be drafted into the self-government agreement, the words that I innately and inherently feel to be just, those words are just and powerful, and they are important to be included in a modern treaty. Words matter, both in oral and written form, and that is the reminder and empowerment that the Declaration provides. It has felt good to know that we are not alone in our negotiations, that many, many Indigenous people in Canada and from around the world have fought for and are still fighting for Indigenous rights. The strength of UNDRIp can be written directly into self-government agreements, and that is what I encourage negotiating parties to a modern treaty to achieve. At the negotiation table I'm at, I'm happy to say that the parties, we have been able to include language and references to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples directly into our self-government agreement. So it is possible. In conclusion, as I wrap up my time to speak, I want to encourage you all to utilize UNDRIp in the work that you carry out, especially in the area of modern treaty negotiations. And I hope that you, as well, as you work with the Declaration, will feel empowered by the strength of the preamble and the 46 articles of the Declaration, which help us to keep Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous laws alive. Must see for your time, and if you have any questions or would like to discuss further, I'm happy to do so and to answer any questions. Must see.
Masi Cho there, Jennifer. Thank you for sharing with us all that information and your experience when working with UNDRIP. Also, shout out to Dora. I just want to say hi, Dora. Up next, we have our next presentation on the relationship between treaty financing and UNDRIP, as Jennifer spoke, and in the preamble before, there's 46 articles, lots going on. And some of the most important stuff really has to come with the samba, the money. So for that, we're going to be going to Matthew Mahaffey. Matthew is a legal expert and consultant working with Westaway Law Group. He spent more than a decade representing Indigenous governments in negotiations related to modern treaties and self-government across Northern and Western Canada. Matthew specializes in fiscal negotiations, including financial transfer agreements, taxation and resource sharing agreements, and funding for programs and services. So with that, we'll just go to Matthew here. And Matthew, welcome to the webinar. I'm looking forward to your presentation. The floor is virtually all yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. If you see me collapse, it's because I had to turn the fan off so that you could actually hear me, and it's about 40 degrees in my apartment in Vancouver this afternoon. So I'll try my best to survive. I grew up in Mayo in the Yukon, which labels itself the hottest and coldest place in the Yukon, but it did not prepare me for this level of heat. So I'll do my best. So as you mentioned just now, you know, fiscal arrangements are the fuel that makes treaty implementation go. Implementing a comprehensive land claim agreement takes money, and it is often the last thing that gets dealt with in negotiations, but it is also often the first thing that starts to impede or compromise the implementation of treaties. And despite over 40 years of modern treaty making in Canada, there's still not a comprehensive approach to funding modern treaty parties in a way that recognizes the needs of the Indigenous party to a treaty, and in a way that acknowledges their role as governments and in governing their lands and their resources. And this is a significant challenge and has been a significant challenge for a long, long time. You can go back to the battles that the Grand Council of the Cree had that led to years of litigation and ultimately to some settlements with the government of Canada. The litigation that the Nunavut had with the government of Canada that resulted in an out-of-court settlement, to the work that many of the comprehensive claim groups with self-government agreements have had to do, including going to dispute resolution with respect to fiscal matters, and lengthy delays in renewing funding agreements. In some cases, funding agreements taking as long to renegotiate a funding arrangement as it took as the term of the agreement was intended. So, spending 5 years attempting to renew a 5-year agreement. And this has been highly problematic for all of the modern treaty nations across the country. And it's still a big challenge, and occurs, the implementation of fiscal matters happens very unevenly across the country. And it really comes down to, there's kind of 3 different ways in which Canada views modern treaties and the funding of modern treaties. There's the treaty nations that have self-government provisions, and those self-government provisions usually include some explicit language around a fiscal relationship and some definition around what that fiscal relationship would look like. And then there are some of the older agreements like the Grand Council of the Cree that have some specific funding obligations. And then there are many of the nations who are on this call from the Northwest Territories will know that the treaties like the Sahtu and the Inuvialuit and the Gwich'in agreements say very little to nothing about funding. And as a result, those nations are treated very differently from any others in Canada. And there has been, it's not all doom and gloom. There has been some progress made. But most of the time, funding for Indigenous governments, even in a comprehensive claim world, is very ad hoc and still linked back to Indian band programs and status Indian funding, or funding for predecessor Inuit organizations. And even now, as the government rolls out its distinctions-based funding, and it's just the way it is developing programs, it's doing it without a view to the modern treaty world. And so, particularly on the First Nation side, I know it's been reported from some of the Inuit partners in the land claim world that they're not excluded at the same level on the distinctions-based funding, but on the First Nation side of the modern treaty world, even the new approaches in how Canada is rolling out funding are inadvertently, I think, but still often excluding modern treaty partners, and excluding them in the sense that they fail to recognize them as governments. And I think one of the things, one of the tools, talking, if you think back to some of what John was saying and what Jennifer was talking about, one of the tools that can potentially be used, the declaration doesn't say a lot about funding or a lot about fiscal relations. But the key, it does contain 2 articles that specifically address the fiscal side of things. The first one, of course, is Article 4, and I think that's where it provides a tool to, as John laid out, to potentially close one of the holes in the net, and that is that as part of exercising the self-determination, it needs to include ways and means for financing their autonomous functions. Now, the problem is determining and sorting out with Canada and with the provinces and territories, to the extent that they have a role to play, what that means, and what that framework is going to look like. And that's been the missing piece in the modern treaty world for a long time. Is there's very little shape to that fiscal framework, even when there's explicit provisions. And that has led to some of the conflict and some of the delays in the process. The problem is that Canada's approach to addressing that has not been to better define or better develop an intergovernmental relationship on the fiscal side, where Indigenous governments have appropriate access to government resourcing. It's been to define the relationship along the lines of a program and transfer framework, which then links back to programs and services designed by other governments, and usually then also defined by limitations such as your location on reserve or former reserve land, or whether you're a status Indian or a Métis or Inuit, and those sorts of things, and which is not consistent with the concept of being able to define your own citizenship, and not consistent with a nation's ability to actually implement jurisdiction and design its own, how it is going to provide its services to its citizens. And that's really what has to change. And hopefully, the recognition that there needs to be better ways and means to do that will be recognized by the government of Canada. We're not seeing that yet, even though the government has worked for several years to develop legislation. Their policies and their mandates have not changed. And this is where I think I couldn't agree more with what Hayden was talking about earlier, about needing to have an evaluation framework. Because really, we have, on the fiscal side of things, all the tools that are necessary to have a proper fiscal relationship exist today. But we don't have it. And so hopefully the adoption of UNDRIp and the passing of the implementation legislation is a sign of a greater level of intent to actually build that, and build a framework that enables the Indigenous governments to participate in the fiscal federation in the same way that other governments do. It can't continue to be a relationship where it's an offloading and a devolution of programs and services, offset by the expectation that an Indigenous government will engage in at-risk participation in the market economy to try to subsidize that. And that's, the declaration talks a lot about participation in the economy. And it's true that we need far greater Indigenous participation in the broader economy. We have to be careful not to allow that to be then interpreted as requiring Indigenous governments to be involved in the market economy directly in order to pay for basic programs and services. Because that's not how governments function in Canada. That's not how governments resource themselves in Canada. And it creates a very unstable source of government funding. You should not have to pay for water and sewer and roads and schools by taking a risk in the private marketplace. No government in Canada has to do that in order to provide its basic services. So it's very important that we take advantage of this opportunity. We use the provisions that are there. They complement what already exists in many existing treaties to reshape how Indigenous governments participate in the fiscal structure and change it from one of transfers and program subsidies to one that's more based on a sharing of the government wealth that's generated from the lands of Indigenous people across the country in an appropriate way that ensures they have the stable financial base to not only address the need to provide services on an ongoing basis, but to mitigate the impacts that colonial policies have had on Indigenous communities and rebuild those and close those the gaps, for lack of a better term. I know it's not a popular term, but to change the outcomes that have resulted from these policies in the past. So I'll just leave it there, and thank you very much.
All right, there. Thank you, Matthew, for your presentation, especially when it comes to finances. I know John Bezo mentioned it a lot in his presentation about all these holes in this net that we're trying to make use of. I think it's pretty clear to define some of those holes from a lot of these presentations here. So thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Jennifer, John, and Hayden. We have a panel of expertise and knowledge holders in many different areas, but especially when it comes to the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is the time where we're going to go to the rest of the webinar. We've been asking people to post their discussion points, their comments in the chat section. If you can do that, that'd be much appreciated. We have a couple of questions, one about overheating. Are you guys overheating yet? But also from Doug Matthews, he has a commentary I'd like to share. So thank you, Doug, for sharing this. It says that while the federal government may have legislation in place or planned that can help MT holders with implementation and modern treaty holders with implementation, the constant turnover of federal staff charged with implementation makes progress difficult. How are we to ensure that the how do we ensure implementation in that system? So obviously we have federal elections, and sometimes we don't know if it's liberals or conservatives seem to be going back and forth. With that comes like new people in these cabinet positions and these ministerial positions. And definitely there's a steep learning curve when it comes to modern treaties and understanding the past, the present, and where we're going in the future. So we have John B kind of addressed it a little bit. I was wondering, John, can we go to you for this question? And then maybe we can go to the rest of the panels if they want to chime in as well too. So John, do you want to take a stab at Doug Matthews' discussion point when it comes to the implementation and the changeover?
Yes, governments are just more than elected bodies sitting in a house. They also license agencies and businesses and NGOs and you know a lot of entities to operate that they license, and that's where the bulk of the people work in Canada, and that's the bulk of where they operate. But we have to remember, because they're licensed by governments, it means that they're partners to treaties, you know, the original treaties. And so the implementation in those areas, beyond just recognition of governments, it's the local individuals who are partners to the treaties they also have to get a good understanding so that, if there's capacity building or they're doing job postings, well, they have to take those things into consideration, especially in health, especially in education and social services. In those areas, people that work in that area, we're all treaty partners, like they say. And I see UNDRIP as reaching the masses of people that can have that influence. Masi.
Oye, Masi, John, Hayden, do you want to jump in here as well too?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's just important to remember that the federal legislation doesn't bring UNDRIP into Canada overnight, right? The legislation is about bringing Canadian laws into alignment with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So in a modern treaty context, to develop those action plans for what that looks like, there's going to have to be some lobbying of federal officials. It's not really going to happen at the level of the bureaucracy. It really has to be a strategic approach where federal officials are aware of the concerns of modern treaty holders, whether that's through the Land Claims Coalition of Canada or not, and really make a case for bringing laws that already exist into alignment with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or laws that will exist into alignment with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So when the federal government is developing these action plans for how UNDRIP is going to be implemented or how laws are going to be aligned with UNDRIP, there has to be constant dialogue, or else modern treaty holders will be left behind, because the national Indigenous organizations, whether they're the AFN, the ITK, MNC, whoever they are, they're going to dominate that agenda. And so when they're dominating that agenda, no one's going to be lobbying on behalf of modern treaty holders. So the federal government's not going to step up and voluntarily amend those laws to bring them into alignment with UNDRIP. So before we even get to the conversation around the bureaucrats and the constant changeover of the bureaucrats, which I actually think is a federal strategy to delay progress, there has to be that higher level lobbying to actually ensure that modern treaty holders are getting a voice into the conversation about which laws are being aligned and how they're actually aligning. And then structurally, the federal government has a committee system for high level discussion and debate on these issues. And in the British Columbia legislation, there's actually a proposal to bring in Indigenous representatives to sit on those committees. So again, having modern treaty representation on those committees that are reviewing federal laws to see whether they align or not align would be an effective strategy, I think, to help with the implementation side of thing. And then, of course, down the road, we have to worry about this question of federal bureaucrats recognizing that these laws have changed and implementing that, because we know that that's not always the case in a modern treaty context. You have constitutionalized documents that are sometimes ignored, and it will take a lot of work to change that in this case too.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Hayden and John B. Also, thanks to Doug for that question. Well, I'm going to get to one concerning negotiating fiscal agreements for Matt from Dr. Stephanie Orbacher-Fox. But before that, maybe we can go to Jennifer for this next question from Grace Martin. In the chat, Grace mentioned that Jennifer spoke to the importance of UNDRIP in the negotiating phase of modern treaties and self-government agreements. Because UNDRIP provides words, something written to stand on, and a sense of unity with Indigenous peoples around the world. How can implementing UNDRIP help address challenges in implementing agreements that have already been negotiated? Jennifer, would you feel comfortable being first to address this comment or this question?
Sure, yeah, that's a good question. So for agreements that are already negotiated, we have to keep in mind that this is now federal legislation. So depending on where the agreement, self-government agreement, modern treaty is the federal government does have a certain level of responsibility now with this legislation to ensure that it's going to align with the existing treaties. As we're hearing from Dr. Hayden King, there's going to be a lot of work to be done still in the implementation of this federal legislation. And then, of course, this is only federal legislation. So if there are whatever provincial or territorial parties are also signatories to that modern treaty or self-government agreement, then an analysis will have to take place as well. If it's in like BC, we know they have their legislation in place to implement provincially the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but they're the first territorial or provincial jurisdiction to have that legislation in place. So again, what I was speaking to, that's what I was emphasizing, you know, in the work that you're doing right now with your modern treaty agreements, take a look at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, really examine the legislation which Canada has just adopted. They're working on an action plan right now, the federal government, on how to fully realize that federal legislation. So getting involved in those conversations and making sure that your voice is heard and that whatever existing treaty that you have, that you can then bring your comments and concerns forward on how the federal legislation is to apply to that existing treaty to ensure that the human rights of Indigenous peoples are protected. So for the existing treaties, there's, like I said, there's a lot of work to be done, and the treaties that are still being negotiated, there's a lot of advocacy still to be done. And then, as the other presenters were saying, even now that we have this legislation, we still need that independent, autonomous body that is going to provide that oversight to ensure that Canada is keeping its commitments. So everyone from the bureaucrats to the politicians need to have that monitoring and that oversight to ensure that they are following the commitments that they have made. So it's been a long fight. It's going to continue. It's going to be every day. And we're counting on all of the Indigenous people and all of our allies to stay with us and to stay strong. So I hope that answers the question. And if any of the other panelists want to add on, I'm happy to hear their voice as well.
All right, thanks for that, Jennifer. And yeah, anybody else from the panel would like to jump in? Maybe you could just put your finger up there. Is that all right, Matthew?
I think one area that may help in the long run is throughout the declaration, as the different articles are spelled out, they often include terminology along the lines of the state will take effective measures to ensure that something happens. And hopefully that's one piece that will speed up treaty implementation. Because ironically, in most treaties, even there's nothing real explicit that says that the treaty will be implemented. So it provides a whole bunch of, and that's always been one of the barriers, not to go back to funding, but on the funding side, if the position has often been, and actually the official policy of the government of Canada is still today on treaty implementation funding, if the treaty doesn't say the Gwich'in shall do A, B, and C, then there's no funding. Even if the treaty says the government of Canada shall do A, B, and C with the Gwich'in, there's no funding for the Gwich'in to do their part of it. And UNDRIp seems to be heading in a little bit of a different direction with those, you know, and obviously it's subject to some interpretation, but the fact that it does commit the states to taking measures to actually ensure that these rights and the different articles are implemented should in the long run help move treaty implementation forward into a more proactive and less reactive stance from the government.
All right, Hayden.
Yeah, just a brief comment. I mean, I think that, and I don't want to be the bearer of bad news again, but this is federal legislation, and we don't want a situation once again where just like treaties, where treaty holders have to go to the provinces and territories and say, let's implement this thing, and they refuse, whether it's through obfuscation or delay or outright rejection, and then you got to sue the federal government to actually get implementation of the modern treaty. I could see the same thing happening with the UNDRIP legislation. I could see the territories, Nunavut, whatever, saying, well, this UNDRIP legislation is federal, it's not territorial. Even though, as Gonèk'e has just commented on TRC call to action, federal and provincial government shall implement UNDRIP. Right now, that's not the obligation. It's exclusively federal. So I could imagine a scenario where treaty holders are saying to the federal government, look, you have this legislation. It could be helpful for our modern treaty, but the territory or the province is refusing to actually implement it. What do we do now? And then the federal government might just be throw up their hands and say, well, they have to pass their own piece of legislation. So a lot of the conversation might actually, be not relevant to the conversation of modern treaties, because it's exclusively federal legislation, and the modern treaty context, a lot of that relationship is with territories.
Thanks for that there, Hayden, Matthew, and Jennifer. And also thanks to Grace for that question on the chat. We have about less than 15 minutes. So I'm going to try to get to a couple more questions. We have one on resource development, but Dale Turner just had a nice little comment concerning Indigenous languages. So we're dealing with a lot of different knowledge systems here and different degrees of rights, Aboriginal rights, inherent rights. And then, within the Canadian colonial legal system, we got sui generis when it comes to explaining Aboriginal rights. But in these knowledge systems, maybe we can go to John B. for this. What role do Indigenous languages play in empowering Indigenous rights in the common law and then contemporary Indigenous politics? John, can we go to you for that?
I guess for the first one, with the agreements are between the parties, meaning that the nation, Canada, and the provinces or Northwest Territories. That a lot of the implementation is to maintain that relationship. The transactions, the effects that legislation might have, new movements. But what about the relationship to the land, to the language, to the culture, to the way of life? Well, that's our business, because part of the governance that we have is that you see in the Northwest Territories, a lot of on-the-land programs, a lot of language development, a lot of cultural revitalizations, these on-the-land programming, canoe trips, the gatherings, the celebrations. Those are Indigenous strengthening exercises, that the more we exercise what we do among ourselves, that the onus is on our Indigenous governments to finance and do things to strengthen those kind of things, because it's through that strengthening exercise that we empower our young people to go forth and learn everything, not only about themselves, but the relationship that their ancestors have developed that were never implemented. So so that the words that we hear across Canada, like in the north in our area, we say strong like two people, that our young people should be strengthened into the two world values, so that they can feed off both and work in a system of developing and enhancing that understanding when it's working in the both worlds. I see.
Hey, Mussy, for that. Jennifer or Hayden or Matthew, do you guys want to jump? Jennifer, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, John, I think that was an excellent answer for sure. Yeah, languages, Indigenous languages are so important when we're negotiating our agreements. And that's why I gave the shout out to my mom at the beginning as well, because she's the interpreter and translator on our self-government agreement. And the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples really speaks to the importance of our Indigenous languages when we're building our strong institutions. And I do workshops quite regularly with the language experts here in the community as we are changing a lot of the English, interpreting the English words into Gonèk'e. And I'm frequently just amazed and inspired by the work of the language speakers here, and how much their understanding and the Indigenous language really informs our own governance systems, Indigenous governance systems. And so I would just continue to encourage everyone working with UNDRIp and in modern treaty implementation to really ensure that as many words as possible and terms can be translated from English into your Indigenous language, because really that's contributes to, again, the strength of that self-government agreement and the revitalization and continued existence of Indigenous peoples. So, Mussy.
Excellent. Thanks for that there, Jen, and thanks for that, John. I'm just going to go to one more question because of time. This is coming from David Wright. Says, thanks for all the excellent session. Question for everyone regarding free and prior informed consent is included in UNDRIp. What examples do you see of clear consistency and inconsistencies between the declaration and specific treaty provisions like co-management regimes, expropriation divisions, explicitly consultation and consent provisions? So I guess the question about free and prior and informed consent, Hayden, do you want to jump on this?
Yeah, I think, there's the spirit and there's the intent of modern treaties, and there's the written versions of the document. And modern treaties, even though they can be very long and complex, full of legal language, they can be interpreted in different ways. And so a good example of that is the regulatory regime. A good example of that is an example that happened in Yukon a few years ago with the Peel Watershed decision, whereby the Indigenous signatories to the modern treaty expected to have significant input into the land use plan for the Peel Watershed. But the language of the treaty said, even if those treaty holders didn't agree with the government's approach, the government could still proceed as long as they consulted. And the judge in that case said, well, that may be what the treaty said, but there's also there's the spirit of the treaty as well. And you can't just take what the Indigenous treaty holder said and throw it out the window and then turn the entire region into, an open pit mine or whatever. And so that was consent that was forced, right? Indigenous people had to go to the court to force their understanding of what consent meant in the treaty. And in each of the northern jurisdictions, we've seen this happen. In Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and Yukon, there have had to be court cases to force a certain interpretation of modern treaties because they don't explicitly say that the communities have free, prior, and informed consent. Instead, they use the language of consultation. So there is actually an inconsistency in the language in the actual treaties and the language in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People when it comes to consent. So through some sort of process that ideally would be led by modern treaty holders, both sort of discursively, but also maybe legally, there could be an agreement around sort of operationalizing consent in a way that meant that First Nations and Inuit didn't have to go to court to have their interpretation of the modern treaty upheld. So I think that what the federal law could do is fill some gaps that exist in the modern treaty.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Hayden. Time right now, we got like 2:26 on the clock, Mountain Standard Time. Like 4 more minutes left. So I'm going to, as the moderator, come to a close for this webinar. Just wanted to thank everybody that joined this webinar out there. Also to all the speakers or panelists. We got Hayden King, Matthew, John Bizot, Jennifer Duncan. Thanks for sharing all your expertise and your perspective on this. I know I learned a lot. Hopefully people in the webinar learned a lot as well too. This session has been recorded and will be stored on the moderntreaties.clincho.ca website. Maybe we could throw the link up there with Jessica. So it's recorded, will be on there as a resource. And this is not the only time we'll be having the opportunity to do something like this. There will be a continuation of this series in September, October, November, and December. So I just want to thank everybody for coming to this webinar, Gonèk'e on our land, UNDRIp and Modern Treaties. Shout out to the Land Claim Agreements Coalition and Carleton University for hosting this, and the national office, which is also hosted by the Cliccho government. It's good to see all these organizations coming together to create opportunities of learning like this as well too. Like Jennifer said earlier, you are not alone when you're negotiating and implementing your modern treaty processes. It's important to reach out and learn as much as we can. And from my perspective, sitting here, I think this is a pretty exciting time. This is like talking about building nations or rebuilding nations that we've had for thousands of years here in this part of the world. This country, Canada, this colonial system really kind of came from another part of the world. As Canadians, we've never had the opportunity to create our own systems of governments that actually make sense for the people that live here. So this is a great opportunity to work together to try to create some systems of governments that actually make sense for the people that live here. And hopefully a lot of these kind of colonial holes within our net can be addressed and fixed by coming together and having opportunities like this as well too. So with that, I would like to say Masi Cho, a big thank you to everybody, to our panelists, to the webinar, and everybody joining us. My name is Gonèk'e from the Hoti Tzeda offices, 10th floor, Blank Building in Sambake, Den and Day. I bid you adieu. Hopefully you don't melt. Stay cool out there. Take care of each other, and have a great day. Masi Cho, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Masi, everybody.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if you wanted me to just like kill the Zoom meeting or let everybody leave naturally.
Yeah, let's let people leave naturally as people can leave in a virtual meeting. Thanks for your help there, Chris, Pito, and Jessica. Thanks for helping me in the background and your support. I appreciate it. But I think everything went all right.